Hello, and welcome back to Miss History. I'm Rhonda, and this is where I talk about odd or unsolved historical mysteries. And if that sounds like something you might be interested in, then please consider subscribing. I hope you've all been well. This week, we're going way back. I mean, way back. To a time of powdered wigs and questionable hygiene. Hop into my fictitious time machine and let's go. Diddly-doot, 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 diddly-doot. And here we are in Edinburgh, Scotland. We are in the year 1567 at Kirkhope Field, where we see the bodies of Lord Darnley and his valet, William Taylor, in their night clothes, both deceased. The house from which they fled has exploded, an explosion caused by 2 barrels of gunpowder. Now, in order to get to this point, we have to travel back to the earlier times of Lord Darnley. Remember, this is early royalty, and family lines were a little questionable. Think of it like this. You take this wolf. You breed it with this wolf from the same litter. Do that about 100 times with the expectation that you're going to get this. But instead, you end up with this. Excellent. So anyway, hop back in. Here we go. Diddly-doot, 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 boom. Henry Stuart, aka Lord Darnley, I'll refer to him as both interchangeably. He was born in 1545 at Temple Newsman, Leeds, which is west of Yorkshire. And apparently the year of his birth isn't known for certain because the rumor is his parents weren't together in early 1545. And further clouding the date is a letter from March of 1566 written by Mary, Queen of Scots, which indicated that Lord Darnley, Henry, was 19 at the time. Historians believe that the year of his birth was probably more likely 1546. Henry was a descendant to both James II of Scotland and Henry VII of England, giving him a potential claim to both the Scottish and English thrones. Bear with me because I will have to be referring to my notes with frequency. The family line is crazy. Henry's father was Matthew Stuart, the 4th Earl of Lennox. Matthew was the son of John Stuart. Not that John Stuart. John Stuart, the 3rd Earl of Lennox. And Lady Elizabeth Stuart, who was the daughter of John Stuart, who's not the same John Stuart, I don't think, but this is early medieval royalty, so he was apparently the 1st Earl of Athol. So maybe not the same John Stuart, just the same name, but not that John Stuart. Matthew is also the paternal grandfather of King James IV of Scotland and 1st of England, who is the same person with 2 titles. Stay with me. So, after the death of Matthew's father, his mother would send him and his brother to France, where they would stay with their uncle Robert, who was the 5th Lord of Aubigny. They were then enrolled in the Garde Écossaise, or the Scottish Guard, who were to be the personal bodyguards to the French monarchy. Royalty. Ugh. When King James V of Scotland died in 1542, Matthew was urged by Cardinal Beaton to return to Scotland to rival James Hamilton, who was the second Earl of Arran, for the throne. Matthew would arrive days after Parliament would declare James as the regent and heir to the throne after the infant Mary, Queen of Scots. So here's where we get fun times. Both James and Matthew had claims to the throne, as they were both descendants of Mary Stuart. Mary was the daughter of King James II of Scots. So, Battle of the Throne is started, and it's said that James had the better claim to the throne, as he was a grandson to Mary through the male line, and that Matthew was the great-grandson through the female line. All of that said, Matthew would argue that James was illegitimate for the throne because his father failed to divorce his first wife before marrying James's mother. That was a big deal, illegitimacy. Big deal. So this would lead to some confusing times, at least for me when I was researching this. It's all very Game of Thrones. From what I could gain, James would make the Treaty of Greenwich, with England in 1543, in which he hoped to betroth Mary, Queen of Scots, to Prince Edward Tudor, who was the son and heir of King Henry VIII of England. I'm Henry VIII, I am. James would fortify Linlithgow Palace, where Mary was held with her mother, Mary of Guise, and the Dowager Queen of Scotland. Matthew would align himself with Cardinal Beaton, who was pro-French. They would set up a camp outside of the palace, but they lacked artillery to wage a war or any kind of assault. Eventually, representatives for each side would come to an agreement that James would rule with the advice of a council. Mary and her daughter would be moved to Stirling Castle, which Matthew would escort them to in 1543. So are we keeping up? Got it? Okay. Apparently, Matthew was coaxed to come to Scotland with the prospect of marriage to the widow, Mary of Guise, and he would end up being offered a chance to marry Lady Margaret Douglas, the daughter of Dowager Queen Mary Tudor, who was the wife of King James IV of Scotland, and the sister of King Henry VIII of England. However, once Matthew had seized French money and artillery that was being sent to Mary of Guise, she offered him the hand of her daughter, Queen Mary of Scots. In a twist, the Parliament of Scotland would end up rejecting the Greenwich Treaty, and this would cause Matthew to change sides and support King Henry VIII's efforts to secure a marriage between Queen Mary of Scots and Prince Edward Tudor. This would lead to Matthew being found guilty of treason in Scotland in 1545 for siding with the English in the War of Rough Wooing by opposing Mary of Guise and Regent Arran, which James. This would lead to the family's Scottish estate being forfeited and sending Matthew into exile to England for 22 years. He would return to Scotland in 1564. It's too much. So anyway, Henry's mother is Lady Margaret Douglas. She was the daughter of the Scottish Queen Dowager Margaret Tudor and her second husband, Archibald Douglas, who was the 6th Earl of Angus. She was also the niece to King Henry VIII of England. Margaret was born in October of 1515 at Harbottle Castle in Northumberland. Sometime in 1528, she would join the household of her godfather, Cardinal Wolsey, and upon his death in 1530, she was invited to the royal palace of Beaulieu and resided in the house of Princess Mary. Margaret, being near the English crown, was brought up chiefly in the English court, closely associated with Mary, who was her first cousin, and the future Queen Mary I of, I think, Scotland. At some point during Anne Boleyn's court, Margaret would be appointed as a lady-in-waiting. Anne Boleyn was the second wife of King Henry VIII, Margaret's uncle, remember? Anyway, Margaret would meet Anne's uncle, Lord Thomas Howard, who also had a brother named Thomas Howard, but he was the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, so don't get the two confused, I guess. Lord Thomas, the first guy, would begin a courtship with Margaret in 1535. The two had fallen in love and become secretly engaged, which, as I understand it, was a big no-no back in those days. Like, how dare you pick your own spouse? What were you thinking? In 1536, King Henry VIII would turn against Anne Boleyn and then learn of Margaret's engagement to Lord Thomas, and he was pissed. Henry, the king, had 2 daughters with Anne, Mary and Elizabeth. He would consider both of them as bastards and therefore illegitimate, and would leave Margaret very high in the line of succession to the throne of England. Her engagement to Lord Thomas was not authorized, and therefore scandalous. This would lead to both Lord Thomas and Margaret being committed to the Tower of London, where Parliament would condemn Thomas to death by an act of attainder for interrupting the succession of the crown. This act also forbade any member of the king's family to marry anyone without the express permission of the king. Sounds like a great time to be alive. Though he was spared execution, Thomas would remain in the Tower. Margaret would break off their engagement, and Thomas would die in the Tower of London in 1537, probably of a broken heart. It would be learned later that the king had thought that the marriage between Lord Thomas and Margaret was an attempt by Lord Thomas to make himself King of England. However, love letters exchanged between the two would show that theirs was a true love affair, and it was ended all due to the paranoia of a king. While in the Tower, Margaret fell ill. She would be allowed by the king to move to the monastery of Sion Abbey under supervision. She would be released from imprisonment in 1537. Fast forward to 1540, when Margaret would once again piss off the king by carrying on an affair with Lord Thomas's half-nephew, Sir Charles Howard. Charlie was the son of Thomas's older half-brother, who was a brother of Henry VIII's 5th wife. Margaret must have had a thing for the Howard family. Just saying. So, like I said, historical records from that time are kind of sketch. One account says that Henry, Lord Darnley, was born in 1545. Or maybe it was 1546, as some records aren't sure that his parents were actually together in 1545. All of that said, another record states that Margaret and Matthew were married sometime in 1544. There are some accounts that state that they had a total of 8, maybe 9 children, with only Henry and a younger brother Charles surviving to adulthood. Young Henry would grow up knowing full well of his status and inheritance, being that he was the great-grandson of King Henry VII of England. He was well-versed in Latin, familiar with Gaelic, English, and French. He would receive an education which would be beneficial to his royal lineage, and it's rumored that he excelled in singing, playing the lute, and dancing. He was also said to be strong, athletic, skilled in horsemanship and weaponry, as well as passionate about hunting and hawking. His father, Matthew, was third in line to the Scottish throne. His mother, Margaret, was a potential successor to the English throne should Queen Elizabeth I die. The family were Roman Catholics, and they were viewed as potential threats to the English Protestants. Queen Elizabeth I was said to have been bright, witty, and well-educated, but as a female had to prove herself. Being as she was a Protestant, there were many Roman Catholics who would have rather seen the Catholic Mary Queen of Scots gain the throne. Roman Catholics would view Queen Elizabeth as an illegitimate heir because her parents' marriage was not recognized by the Catholic Church. Being a descendant from Henry VII, our young Henry was also in the lineage for the English throne. Seriously, all this incestuous stuff makes anything out of Alabama seem tame. Skipping over some of the other wrangling to the throne and incest and nastiness, which would lead to the arrest of Matthew and his family, and then they would ultimately be released by Queen Elizabeth, who would then restore Matthew's rights and titles as Earl of Lennox. We get to the marriage of Mary, Queen of Scots, to our dear Henry, Lord Darnley. Henry would be the second husband to Mary. They would marry in 1565, making him the king consort of Scotland. History says that shortly before their marriage, he became the Duke of Albany. The two would have only one son, King James IV of Scotland and I of England, and he was born in 1566. According to historical records, it was February of 1565 when Henry would present himself to Mary, Queen of Scots, at Weymouth Castle in Fife, and it was reported that she, quote, Her Majesty took well with him and said that he was the lustiest and best proportioned long man that she had ever seen. So apparently this means that she found him attractive and tall. According to historical archives, Henry did stand over 6 feet tall. Remember, okay, so we have to go back. Matthew was originally pledged to be to Lady Margaret, who he ended up marrying, but was also told he could marry Mary, Queen of Scots, which his son married. Okay, cool. Anyway, Mary and Henry would take a brief visit to see his father. Then they would return to Holyrood. On February 25th, it said that he would hear John Knox preach, and then he would dance a galliard with Mary that night. And it is said that the two were inseparable and constant companions after that. Henry was Mary's half first cousin through two different marriages by their grandmother, Margaret Tudor. Each of them was in high succession for the English throne. As Henry was also a descendant of a daughter of James II of Scotland, he was in line for the Scottish throne. Like I said, Henry was made the Duke of Albany. That happened on July 22nd of 1565. On July 28th, a proclamation was made at the Cross of Edinburgh that the government would be in the joint names of the King and the Queen of Scots, which gave Henry equality with and precedence over Mary. The two would marry on July 29th by Roman Catholic rites in Mary's private chapel at Holyrood. Henry, though raised Catholic, had been influenced by Protestantism, and he refused to accompany Mary to the nuptial mass that followed the wedding, which is a great way to start a marriage. Apparently, Mary would notice the vain, arrogant, and other negative qualities about her new husband, which now was threatening the well-being of the state. Henry was very unpopular with other nobles, had a violent streak which was aggravated by drinking, and just sounded like an all-around privileged jerk. Due to all of this, Mary would refuse to grant him the crown matrimonial, which would have made him the successor to the throne should she die childless. Yeah, ha ha. Mary would become pregnant less than a month after they married. In March of 1566, David Rizzio, who was the private secretary to Mary, was stabbed 56 times by Henry and allies of the Protestant Scottish nobles in front of the then 6-month pregnant queen, as they dined in her private quarters. It was rumored that Rizzio was actually the father of Mary's child. Henry, either he did it or he had it done, killed Rizzio in a bid to force Mary to cede the crown matrimonial. And it's also stated that part of his bargain with his allies to help him advance to the crown matrimonial in Parliament, he would restore their lands and their titles. So, like a weird game of telephone, this happens, and news of Rizzio's death travels and reaches the Spanish ambassador who's in Paris, and the headline there was that Henry, quote, had murdered his wife, admitted the exiled heretics, and seized the kingdom. That's not really what happened, but, you know. Henry would post a declaration denying any knowledge of the murder or having been involved in it. Mary would no longer trust her husband, and Henry would be disgraced by the kingdom. On March 27th, 1566, the Earl of Morton and Lord Ruthven, both present at the murder of Rizzio, both later fleeing to England, would write a letter to William Cecil. I'm not sure really who he was in all of this, but it said that he heard that Henry's actions drove Henry's father, Matthew, out of the Scottish court. Anyway, they wrote a letter to this Cecil guy stating that Henry had in fact initiated the murder of Rizzio and recruited them due to his hatred of Rizzio. Henry was a jerk. If you get nothing else from this story, just remember, Henry was a drunken, arrogant, violent, murderous, pompous, probably misogynistic jerk. So anyway, regardless of his insanity, Mary would birth Henry a son. That son was named James, who was the future King James the Sixth of Scotland and first of England. Did I mess up my Roman numerals? No, I did not. Anyway, James was born June 19th, 1566 at Edinburgh Castle. The birth of their son made succession more secure, but their marriage was still rocky. Henry had successfully alienated many of his supporters due to his erratic behavior. His continued insistence that he be awarded the crown matrimonial was an ongoing source of frustration in the marriage. James would be baptized Charles James in December of 1566 in a Catholic ceremony. It's not really clear whether or not Henry was in attendance at either the baptism or the party that followed, but he was lodged in the castle somewhere. Sometime in 1567, Henry would fall ill. Some records state that he had contracted and was recovering from smallpox in the weeks that led up to his death. Others speculate, however, that it may have been syphilis, due to the coitus that he had been having outside of his marriage. His illness was described as him having deformed pox on his body and his face. He would for a time stay in Glasgow with family until his bride brought him back to recuperate at the old Provost lodging at Kirk o' Field, which is a 2-story house and a short walk from Holyrood. Henry would stay in the house with one of his servants while Mary attended a wedding at Holyrood. Sometime around 2 o'clock in the morning, an explosion would rock Edinburgh, and this explosion was ignited by barrels of gunpowder that were left in the basement under the sleeping quarters of Henry. It is rumored that perhaps Henry had heard of the plot on his life, and he and his servant attempted to flee. After the explosion, Henry and his servant were found outside, surrounded by a cloak, dagger, chair, and a coat. Henry was only in his nightshirt, suggesting that he had left in a hot hurry. One other servant of Henry's was still in the house and was found there in the rubble of the explosion. It's believed that Henry had been smothered, as there were no signs of strangulation or other violence to the body. That said, a post-mortem exam, which I didn't know existed in the 1500s, would show internal injuries that were thought to have been caused by the explosion. John Knox, who was a Scottish minister, believed that the surgeons were lying about the post-mortem discovery and the damage, believing that Henry had in fact been strangled. Historical sources agree that while there were no marks on the body, there was no reason for the surgeons to lie. Either way, Henry was murdered. But by who? As I said earlier, Henry was pretty much a jerk. Historians actually described him as vain, selfish, and manipulative. Quote, people reviled him for his arrogance, drunkenness, and promiscuity. Apparently, he wanted it all. And it said that he wanted his wife to be submissive to him, and she wasn't playing that game. Like, homie, don't play that. One record said that he had initiated the murder of her assistant in front of her in the hopes that she would have a miscarriage, thus forcing her to grant him the crown matrimonial. As it was, he would only ever be the husband of the queen and never her equal reign. Ha. Well, we see that didn't really work out, but knowing what we know about him now, I could see him setting up that whole thing.
Sure.
You know, I want. Probably stamped his feet like a little toddler. Anyway, Mary was no longer enamored by her husband, the lustiest man she'd ever seen. And who would be enamored with him anymore after, he like planned a coup against you? I wouldn't. She became a likely suspect, though, in his death. She was in attendance at a wedding of one of her assistants on the night of the murder, and it was no secret that she and Henry had a contemptuous relationship. He was promiscuous, ill-tempered, ongoing plots to gain power, all earning him quite a bit of hatred, and likely a lot of enemies. One theory that supported Mary being the one who killed him, or at least being somewhat responsible for it, comes from the fact that she married Lord Bothwell later that same year as the death of Henry, making Lord Bothwell Mary's third husband. There are alleged love letters, sonnets, and marriage contracts found in a silver casket, all belonging to Lord Bothwell. But Mary had always insisted that these were fakes, and a commission that investigated the murder agreed that the letters proved nothing, and they found her innocent. Apparently, Mary would go into mourning for her dead husband for 40 days at Linlithgow Palace. She would return to Edinburgh in April of 1567. But while she was on the road, she was stopped by the Earl of Bothwell and his men. Bothwell would insist that there was danger ahead for her, and for her protection, she should accompany him to his home at Dunbar Palace, which she did. Now, it's really unclear what happened next, but either Mary really did fall in love with Lord Bothwell, or, as history suggests, he raped her and forced her to marry him. Great guy. But either way, they were married in Edinburgh. He was not well received with the Confederate lords due to an earlier coup attempt. Incest and coups. Yay, medieval times. Another theory involved Queen Elizabeth I, or at least those associated with her. Apparently, the birth of James, the son of Mary and Henry, would succeed Elizabeth to the throne. So, in part, if the Queen was involved, it only partially worked. The murder of Henry would destroy the Scottish monarchy, but not so much the English one, as we all know now, due to the current Queen. Mary and Lord Bothwell would be captured by the Confederate lords. Her half-brother would be installed as regent in Scotland until her son came of age. Mary would flee to England, where Queen Elizabeth I would have her arrested and imprisoned for the next 19 years. The murder of Lord Darnley that night at Kirkhope Field changed history. Mary, Queen of Scots, was the last monarch of Scotland and abdicated her throne to her 1-year-old child while still imprisoned in Loch Leven Castle. Mary would remain in English custody until 1587, when the conference at Westminster would find her guilty of treason and execute her. Her son would align himself with Queen Elizabeth and become King James VI of Scotland and the First of England. Have you ever heard of this case? Is it medieval royalty lineage fun? No, really not. So, was it Henry's wife, Queen Mary of Scots? Was it Queen Elizabeth I, who was probably related to him somewhere on the one limb of the tree? What are your thoughts? Let me know down in the comments below. Weird times. So don't forget to like and subscribe. Click that bell icon to be notified every time I post a new video. Until next time, stay safe out there. It's a crazy world we live in. Bye.